turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
questions,
Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists, the show where we bring you the latest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine with me, Chris Smith. And this week, how tech and AI are playing their part in the closest US election in living memory.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
The United States has announced sanctions against some executives of Russia's state-funded news outlet RT and a number of other individuals, accusing them of trying to influence the presidential election in November.
A lot of countries are going to try to manipulate our voters. They're going to try to manipulate our elections. That's what they do.
People not knowing where to go to get trustworthy facts.
The US election between Democratic nominee Kamala Harris and Republican nominee Donald Trump is going down to the wire. Indeed, this has been described by many as the closest presidential election ever seen. Inevitably, with tensions so high on either side, the cry of electoral interference is a common one. But just how is today's technology being used to sway voter opinion? And to what extent? Well, that's what we're seeking to uncover on this week's programme, beginning with an outline of just how close this election is. Scott Lucas is an expert on US politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and at the University of Birmingham. He's also founder and editor-in-chief of EA Worldview, which is a leading site for coverage of international affairs.
So the dramatic change in this year's election was in late July when President Joe Biden stood down and let Kamala Harris run this very, very brief but intense campaign to try to hold the White House for the Democrats this time around.
Because probably those sentiments you've expressed have been reflected in the polling hitherto, haven't they? We can focus on how close it is now in a second, but there had been quite a gulf opening up between where Biden sat and Trump now.
The indicators beyond the polls was that Biden's age was sucking all the oxygen out of the room, and so Trump's lead was widening, including in the 7 states that will decide the election. As soon as Harris replaced Biden in the race, Trump's advantage in those 7 states, and indeed nationwide, disappeared. And ever since then, it has been a 50-50 race, and I think it will remain a toss-up all the way to November 5th.
And is it literally that close at the moment? It's sitting around the centre point, 50-50 each way at the moment?
So in the 7 states that will determine this election, in each of the 7, the gap between Harris and Trump is less than 2%. And in 5 of the 7 states, the gap is less than 1%.
And how do we regard social media in all this? Is that going to be a big player? It seems to be dominating all the headlines. Who's saying what online? Is that the new way you win elections?
Well, social media has been an influence in U.S. elections all the way back to 2008, when Barack Obama's campaign used that platform very effectively to propel him and to propel his views over the Republican John McCain. Then we've seen, as social media and the technology behind it develops, and as you have new platforms that come forward, whether you're talking about Facebook, whether you're talking about Twitter, now Instagram and TikTok, that this is the way that people are reached quickly. This is the way that not necessarily full discussions of issues, but at least sound bites from the candidates are presented. So I would say not only that social media has become more important, I would say that social media actually is overtaking traditional media in being the platform for immediacy in terms of seeing the candidates and thus making your decision on which of those candidates you support.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because Donald Trump got thrown off Twitter, and then Elon Musk spent billions, tens of billions, buying it and has reinstated him and is also backing him. So has Elon Musk basically spent tens of billions in order to help one potential candidate here?
Well, social media is not necessarily a neutral venue in terms of elections. And what we have seen with Elon Musk takeover of Twitter, converting it into effectively a personal platform, which tries to propel his beliefs, his views, and his alliances, is that this, in effect, is an attempt to make that outlet a Donald Trump platform, as well as Trump's own social media platform, Truth Social. So Musk, who has personally given $250 million to Trump. This is not hidden. The fact is that Musk is now part of a social media environment in which the platform might be one where everybody can join in, but the people running the platform can politicize it and tilt it or try to tilt it to make a difference in an election.
Indeed, are there any rules around any of this? Because presumably all it would take is some lines of code to get inserted into the algorithm to just tilt the balance a bit, and you could very dramatically change what people were exposed to, who they were introduced to as possible followers, etc., and rebalance things in a different direction.
The US government and the courts effectively gave up on regulating balance in media in the 1980s when they removed the fairness doctrine. So that's not new. What has been significant is that with this brave new world of the media that we now have, is that there's really been no attempt to bring in a regulation. There's no particular federal authorities, at least in the United States, that can tell Elon Musk, you really cannot put up these posts, which are flagrant violations of balance, flagrant violations of fairness, and in some cases coming very, very close to breaking laws. So no, I effectively, if you talk about Facebook stroke Meta, if you talk about a Google, if you talk about an X, you really are dependent upon those who oversee those platforms to play fair, to play by the rules. There's no chance that the government can step in and make them do so.
The new kid on the technological block is also AI, and this has been sort of the word of the year for a few years running, very, very rarely out of the papers. What role might that play, and how are politicians, policymakers worried about that? What threat does it pose?
Again, AI is getting a lot of attention now, but AI has been with us for some time in terms of the ability to generate images to try to get out there and influence what we see, to influence how we think. What is distinctive in 2024 is, of course, the speed and the depth to which AI can generate text, or it can generate sounds, or it can generate videos.
We've also had headlines about the UK Labour Party sending activists over to the US to campaign on behalf of one of their candidates. What sort of role, or what's the level of concern about international interference from, I want to say you can't really include the UK as a rogue state, but other rogue states, Iran certainly on the list, China has also got form in this area, and especially Russia, as you've just mentioned.
I think the specific allegation of the UK's foreign interference is an example of how social media can be manipulated. In fact, not to give us the truth, but to give us deception. This, in fact, was actually foreign interference of a different kind. It was a UK politician named Nigel Farage who put out the false statement that Labour Party activists may have been paid to work with the campaign of Kamala Harris. Completely untrue. Nigel Farage himself has actually been working with the Trump campaign since 2016. But what he was doing is he was trying to twist what we see on social media and to get traditional media to pick up the story. And he was successful to a degree in doing that. At the same time, that case of almost a distraction in terms of how social media is used and a manipulation of how social media is used took us away from what are the very real issues, the broader issues about foreign powers who have tried for years to interfere in elections.
And we'll hear a bit more about those attempts at foreign interference a bit later on. That was the US political expert Scott Lewis. Let's think about misinformation now. As we were hearing from Scott, Donald Trump was suspended from Twitter, as it was then known, for questioning the legitimacy of the 2020 US presidential election. Mr. Trump had also been accused of disseminating misinformation in a bid to attack his political rivals. But what exactly is misinformation, and why does it matter in the context of this year's ballot? Sander van der Linden is a professor of social psychology at the University of Cambridge, and he's the author of Foolproof: Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity.
There's a lot of talk about misinformation and what it is, and I recently chaired a consensus report for the American Psychological Association where we defined misinformation as information that is either false or misleading. So some information is entirely fabricated, just false, but the more dangerous kind of misinformation is actually more subtle. It will leverage half-truths and bias and manipulation And that's what we call misleading. And it can use logical fallacies or other dubious content where there's actually a grain of truth. And so you can't say that it's entirely false, but it is otherwise misleading with the risk of causing misperceptions that later become widespread. And that's what we call misleading. So misinformation is both false and misleading. And it's different from disinformation, which is misinformation that's produced with the intention to actually harm or deceive other people. So disinformation are intentional lies, whereas misinformation could be an accident, but is still otherwise false or misleading.
How do you see this being deployed in the US election that we're seeing play out at the moment?
Yeah, one of the things that we're most concerned about at the moment is election misinformation around the election results. So I think a lot of people are predicting right now that if, let's say, Donald Trump doesn't win the election, he's going to claim that there was widespread fraud, that the election result isn't legitimate. So I think a lot of people are concerned that the types of misinformation that we'll see will revolve around the integrity of the election.
And on that particular note, I suppose that in this era, when we have platforms like social media and AI also being used to create content at a very, very fast rate, that that becomes a lot more likely that this kind of thing happens.
Absolutely, and especially when you have the owner of a social media platform, such as Elon Musk, actively pushing great replacement conspiracy theories, which, if people don't know, is a conspiracy theory that suggests that illegal immigrants are being imported to replace the white population and use that in the context of voting, suggesting that illegals are voting, that the election isn't secure. These claims have been fact-checked as false. I mean, it's extremely rare, but Elon Musk has the reach of, he has the most followers on X, and he's using the platform to boost his own visibility. So we're talking, hundreds of millions of people, and that is really concerning. He also regularly boosts accounts that share AI generated deepfakes of politicians and other fakery. And so I think that really illustrates the power of not only conspiracy theories and misinformation going viral on social media, but when the owner of a social media platform is actually, pushing it and accelerating it. And that's, really problematic because then you can't intervene in any sensible way.
You've literally written the book about how people can counter this sort of threat. So, what sort of advice can you offer in terms of ways to almost immunize oneself against this sort of political posturing so that people don't necessarily vote for a candidate because of the wrong reasons?
Yeah, so we've worked a lot on this idea of psychological inoculation, which involves exposing people to a weakened dose of a misleading claim or the techniques used to spread misleading claims and refute those in advance. You deconstruct the trick for people in advance using a microdose example so that people can actually build up psychological resistance and even immunity to future exposure to attempts to influence people's vote with misinformation. And for a number of reasons, it's better to try to preemptively protect people than try to debunk things after their brain's been exposed to them because, falsehoods make friends in your memory and with other things that you know, and they integrate themselves in our mental model and becomes incredibly tricky to try to get rid of them. So prevention is better than cure. And right now, we're just posting a study where we're inoculating or pre-bunking, if you will, against election misinformation. And so we're looking at claims that have all been circulating but have no basis in fact, and we expose people to a forewarning that they might see misleading claims from politicians about the electoral process. And then we give people examples of how that's been misused in the past. And then we refute those with the facts known to electoral officials to immunize people against this. Because the problem is that people often don't have the right mental defenses. Not everyone knows how elections work, what the facts are, how voting machines work. It's all very technical. So when you prepare people preemptively to know these things, they're going to be less susceptible on election day and right around the election point when they're being targeted with such false information. And we've tested this, and we were able to inoculate about a third of people who otherwise would have fallen for these claims based on a nationally representative sample in the US.
You sort of alluded to this earlier, but there is a real risk, is there not, at this election, that this sort of misinformation could tip the balance because it's so close, and we probably don't have much time in order to see the effects of pre-bunking type technologies and techniques that you've just been outlining to have an effect.
It is close, and I think we should have done some of the work earlier. But I will say that looking at the media, I've seen them do more preemptive reporting this time. I've seen various articles that have tried to pre-bunk common misinformation. I've talked to organizations that have been out there canvassing, trying to empower people. So I think more work has been done than before. The question is whether it's enough. And most politicians during political debates will say something sometimes that's not accurate. I mean, surely on all sides of the political spectrum, claims are made that need to be fact-checked. But when there is a concerted and overwhelming asymmetry in trying to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the electoral process, when there's really no basis for that, I think that's an overarching kind of concerning trend that should be addressed. And hopefully, regardless of what the election outcome will be a peaceful transfer of power, and people will accept the election results. And I think the problem is that if people are misinformed and they have misconceptions, they're less likely to be confident in the election result. And we know from prior research and reality that that can lead to violence and chaos and polarization. And that's what we're hoping to avoid this time.
Indeed. Sander van der Linden there from the University of Cambridge. You're listening to The Naked Scientists with me, Chris Smith. Still to come, how hostile states may attempt to undermine the democratic process in the US. Let's take a closer look at AI, artificial intelligence now, and the role that this might play in influencing elections. Barbara Triss is a professor of political science at Grinnell College, and she's just written a piece for The Conversation outlining 4 ways in which this might happen. She began by telling me about voter information.
Modern campaigns rely on large digital data sets to inform their interactions with voters, the canvassing, the outreach. So when AI popped onto the scene, I started asking, does it differ fundamentally in ways that these uses have happened before? The short answer is it's different in terms of speed and scale, but it can be used for good and bad.
One of the first things you raised in your article, one of your first concerns you highlight, is actually the information, the raw information being presented to voters. Tell us about that.
When we think about AI and campaign politics, we often gravitate toward images or audio, but voters are accessing artificial intelligence technology on a daily basis. When someone gets on, say, Google and asks for information on anything, you can get an AI product, in Google's case, it's Gemini, to respond to prompts and to give you information kind of packaged in text in a way that sounds very authoritative, it sounds credible. In some ways, it's a version of the same thing, getting more information in the hands of voters, responding to their prompts. But the tricky thing is, well, sometimes you, a user, just kind of stumble into AI not knowing that you're doing it. And then it just sounds so credible and you don't know the sources that are being used. So anyway, the challenges are the same as with, say, an internet search to separate the good from the bad information, but it's probably a little tougher in the AI world.
Indeed, because I've noticed myself, I'm now being presented with search results on Google in the first instance, which it says this is AI generated content, but it's coming right up at the top of the search results. So the first thing you're presented with is this digest almost of what you were searching for. So instead of then having to go and look at individual links to explore on your own terms, you're being presented with this. And so a lazy reader or a lazier reader might be seduced by that and take that as gospel. Is that what you're saying?
That's absolutely what I'm trying to say.
And do you think that that's going to make a malign influence then? Because obviously if the companies are producing good quality tools, then presumably that's going to be a good synthesis of what the current thoughts are.
Sometimes it is. I think it's prone to the same sort of errors that we all are. I mean, and to be fair, the major platforms are being sort of cautious in terms of responding to political questions this cycle. For instance, Gemini will not answer a question specifically about a candidate or about an election, but other AI search tools out there will.
One of the other things that you then move on to in your piece is this question of deep fakes. And this word, it was a new word on me, cheap fakes. Tell us about those and how they might be exerting an influence.
Deepfakes are basically AI produced audio and video that look and sound real. Now, cheap fakes can subsume many different things. They're not necessarily financially cheap, but it's the same thing that doesn't use AI. But the concern about these deepfakes is that they'll be used to deceive and to spread disinformation. The case that really resonates in the US was a deep fake robocall, kind of a recorded audio call before the New Hampshire primary, that is, in the presidential nomination season. The call was meant to sound like President Joe Biden. And so this fake Joe Biden told Democrats in New Hampshire not to vote in the primary, but to save their vote for November, which, that's very misleading. You shouldn't do that.
You also point to the issue of what's being dubbed strategic distraction, where you don't necessarily feed people the wrong thing, but you point them in the wrong direction. How much of an influence is that likely to be exerting?
That's a term that kind of popped into my mind, but a lot of people are concerned about the idea that AI technology can be used to keep from focusing on the things that they need to do to run the election. Election administrators in the US are being overwhelmed with requests for information about voters and challenges to voter eligibility, especially in the battleground states. That is, the handful of states, 7 states, that will likely determine the outcome of the US election. And giving citizens the ability to request information from government is actually a very good thing. But when people are doing it just to overwhelm the system, to keep election administrators from tending to the important tasks that they're supposed to be tending to, that's a real problem. The transition from how it's done now to using AI technology is just really simple. You automate it with a bot. And that's been done in a number of different contexts, in some cases, good government contexts, people trying to get information about, say, emissions, to keep track of the environment. And so it's not too much a stretch to think it could be done for this purpose as well.
What about the question of foreign entities, foreign states becoming involved in what's going on in the United States? There's been this headline recently that the UK Labour Party has got activists, albeit on an voluntary or unpaid basis, potentially, in America, trying to swing people's opinions. What's the situation with that sort of thing?
The idea is that foreign interferers, namely Russia and China especially, are somehow trying to sow discontent within the US population. And this is for the purpose of ramping up a lack of trust in fellow citizens in the US and questioning the integrity of the elections. And kind of the thought is the reason that these foreign entities are doing this is to be able to portray to their own citizens a very unflattering image of Americans. None of this is new. We've seen it done before, in 2016 in particular. But with AI, you can scale things up and you can do it really quickly. And as much as the US government and others, including the media, are onto this, it seems like the bad actors are a step ahead.
Well, let's hope not for too long. Barbara Trish there from Grinnell College. Now, as Barbara just was mentioning, one of the major concerns in this election is foreign interference. Indeed, Russia, Iran and China have all been accused of meddling and attempting to undermine the democratic process. But how do they do it, and what might they attempt to gain from it? Defence and security analyst Michael Clark is a visiting professor at King's College London.
It's pretty clear that Russia is behind a lot of the cyber mischief which takes place across the Western world, and is certainly accused of playing games in the American election. But also Iran, North Korea have been named as countries which are also trying to manipulate voters' thinking in the election by using cyber hacking and false images and false stories and so on. China also has a shadowy role behind all of this, but is also believed to be a a sort of malign influence in trying to affect the way the elections actually take place.
Are these actors actually doing it, or are they just providing the environment that's propitious for doing it? Russia classically breaks all of our copyright rules, etc., because it puts itself into an unpredatable position electronically. So are they actually behind this, these countries, or just providing an environment where hackers who want to do this can go and do it with impunity?
They're doing both. The Russians, in particular, set up quite a lot of private groups that are state sponsored in effect. They pay for them and they just let them get on with it. And those groups are up to all sorts of mischief, but they also do it directly themselves. And they've admitted it. They denied for years that they had anything to do with the 2016 American election. And then Prigozhin, who was the leader of the Wagner group, then boasted about it before he was killed by Putin, which they thought would help President Trump become elected. Now, whether they did help him or not is still a matter of dispute, but it is certainly what they were trying to do, and they've admitted it.
And what exactly were they trying to do? And what did they do?
Well, it comes in different forms. So one thing is to identify using artificial intelligence, using AI to scrape information from lots of sources that, people, their shopping habits, the films they see, the things they download on television. All of that helps to build up a profile of somebody. And they looked at the profiles of people, particularly in the swing states, the states that really matter, where a few thousand votes either way will determine the outcome. And they identified people who were a particular don't knows, if you like, but were more inclined to be Republican, more inclined to be right wing. And they fed them stories. Some of them were true, some of them were completely untrue, but they reinforced their feelings through stories and through giving them a sense of anger to tip them over to Republican voters, away from the Democrats towards the Republicans. That's what they tended to do. We don't really know how effective it was, but they certainly did it.
Do they actually have a preferred candidate? Because you're saying that they wanted to tip things one way or the other. Did they really have an aim in mind, or was the intention just to be disruptive and undermine America, undermine democracy, and therefore destabilize an economy and gain an advantage that way?
Countries like Iran, North Korea, and also China have a more general intention, I think, to destabilize democracy and to, in their view, expose how weak democracy actually is, how difficult it is to make anything happen in a democracy. They have a general view. But Russia, under Putin, very clearly wanted Donald Trump to be elected in 2016, absolutely wants Donald Trump to be elected this time round, because the Russian view is that they'll get a free hand from a Donald Trump presidency to do what they want in Ukraine and in other parts of the world. Putin wants a grand summit with President Trump sometime next year. So if Trump is elected, there'll be a grand summit in the old fashion, the old style Cold War summit of the two big Cold War leaders meeting to determine what the outcome will be for the rest of the world. That's what he wants. He won't get that with Kamala Harris if she's elected, but he will get it with President Trump if Trump is re-elected as president. And the Russians have a very clear interest in seeing a Trump presidency next year.
Presumably, in this era, the technology we now avail ourselves of has made this sort of thing far easier and far more commonplace. We love all of the convenience of this connected world, but in fact it comes with quite a cost.
Elections have always been subject to attempts at interference from the outside. It usually didn't make much difference, and it used to involve newspapers and radio and television and so on. The difference now is the degree of penetration, the degree to which somebody outside can find out exactly who you are, what you like, what you dislike, what really motivates you, what makes you angry, and they can play on that by very, very targeted material.
Can we stop it?
We can't stop it. It's a phenomenon of modern politics and the modern world. We can only understand it better. And so the focus is on helping democracies to be more aware of this and to, in a sense, to grow up. We've got to be more mature. So we've got to recognize it when it happens. And the need for democracies to be far better informed and to have a sense of mainstream truth. That's what we lack these days. I mean, where do you go for your truth? Do you go to the BBC News or to Sky News or ITV News? We'd like to think people do, but by and large, they don't. Unless society has a series of avenues of truth, mainstream truth that people go to when they're not sure. Unless they have that, then they'll be much more easily manipulated.
Do you think it's enough to swing an election?
Well, I think we now live in an era where elections can be swung if they're close. In an election which is not particularly close, say as the British general election was, I don't think anything would have made much difference to the outcome of that election, because there was a real swing of the pendulum in Britain after 14 years of a Conservative government. But where elections are close, and my goodness, this is the closest American election for generations, then of course these things can swing an election. It's happened before in America. The 1960 election that brought John Kennedy into power was very, very close. And there were lots of accusations that election was swung in ways that were illegitimate. And that's been a continuing gripe in American politics really ever since. So it does happen. But this election in 2024 is closer than anyone alive today can ever remember.
Indeed. But time will tell, of course. That was Michael Clark there. And talking of time, that is it for this week. But in parting, no matter what country you find yourself to be in, do be vigilant for falsified or exaggerated claims. Ask yourself if any outlet might have an agenda behind their reporting stance, and wherever possible, always exercise your democratic right to vote. Next time, we're looking at the potential harms of smartphones for children. Should schools be a social media sanctuary? We hear from a worried parent and look at the evidence that neuroscience is presenting to us. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith, and from all of us here at the team, thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.